My name is Claire Whitman, and if someone had told me a year ago that my own sister would deliberately slip something into my coffee, I would have laughed at the absurdity. But here I am, telling a story I never thought I'd live through. A story that began in a quiet suburban kitchen, but unraveled into a nightmare that forced me to question the very meaning of family, trust, and forgiveness. People like to say that blood is thicker than water, that family will always be there for you no matter what. But I learned firsthand that sometimes family can also be the sharpest knife pressed against your back. And when the truth finally came out, the very people who should have protected me, the people who raised both of us, looked me in the eye and told me to forgive. But forgiveness is easy to preach when you're not the one who woke up dizzy, shaking, and terrified after realizing your own sibling had poisoned you. The doctors, however, saw it differently, and one toxicologist in particular made sure the truth couldn't be brushed under the rug. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It all started on a Monday morning in late spring in our small town of Greenville, Ohio. Life wasn't perfect, but it was simple, or at least I thought it was. I was 27, working as a graphic designer remotely, and still living at my parents' home while saving for my own apartment. My younger sister Danielle had moved back in after a messy breakup with her boyfriend, and though she and I had always had a strained relationship, I tried to be civil. Danielle was the kind of person who could make a room spit around her, dramatic, sharp-tongued, and hungry for attention. Growing up, she was the golden child in my parents' eyes, always praised for her looks, her charm, and her confidence, while I was the quieter one, the bookworm, the one who stayed out of trouble. That imbalance of attention had sown seeds of bitterness between us long ago, but I never imagined it would bloom into something so dangerous. The morning it happened felt ordinary, which is what makes it all the more haunting. I remember waking up to the faint smell of coffee drifting through the hallway. Danielle had beaten me to the kitchen, which was rare. She was usually the last one out of bed. She greeted me with an unusual brightness in her tone, almost like she had been waiting for me. "Morning, Claire," she chirped, sliding a steaming mug across the counter toward me. "Made your favorite, hazelnut." I was surprised, but not suspicious. Maybe she was turning a corner. Maybe she was trying to mend things between us. I smiled, thanked her, and took a sip. The coffee was hot, smooth, and tasted normal. If anything, it felt like a small olive branch from a sister who had spent most of her life pushing me away. But within 20 minutes, something began to feel wrong. It started as a slight dizziness, then a heavy fog that settled over my head. My heart raced unevenly, my stomach churned, and my hands trembled as I reached for my phone. I remember trying to focus on my computer screen for work, but the letters blurred together. Sweat prickled my skin, and a wave of nausea crashed over me. I stumbled back to the kitchen where Danielle was leaning casually against the counter, scrawling through her phone. "You okay?" she asked, her eyes flicking up to me with an expression that didn't look worried. It looked amused. I mumbled something about feeling sick and rushed to the bathroom, barely making it in time. I spent the next hour on the cold tile floor, clutching my stomach, convinced I must have caught a stomach bug or maybe eaten something bad the night before. When I told my parents later that afternoon, Danielle jumped in quickly. "Maybe it's just her anxiety acting up again," she suggested, her voice laced with fake concern. My parents nodded sympathetically, as though Danielle's diagnosis carried more weight than my own lived experience. It wasn't the first time she'd used my history of mild anxiety to discredit me, but this time something inside me bristled. The way she said it, the smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth when she thought no one was looking, it didn't sit right. Still, I pushed the thought away. Who suspects their own sister of slipping something into their coffee? That idea was too unthinkable. Family doesn't do that. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. The next morning, Danielle offered to make coffee again. I declined, making my own instead, and noticed the flicker of irritation flash across her face. She covered it quickly, but I didn't miss it. That day, I still felt sluggish, my body heavy and uncooperative, as though something was lingering in my system. A gnawing suspicion began to grow inside me, one I tried desperately to silence.
But when the pattern repeated a few days later, another cup of coffee offered by Danielle, another round of dizziness and nausea after drinking it, I could no longer deny what was happening. It wasn't a bug. It wasn't anxiety. Something was very wrong. And deep down, I knew Danielle was at the center of it. At that point, I faced a silent battle inside myself. Do I confront her directly, risk sounding paranoid to my parents, or do I find proof? I didn't know yet that proof was exactly what I would need, because in our household, Danielle's word carried more weight than mine ever did. My parents had always excused her behavior, chalking it up to her difficult personality or sensitive nature. But what they saw as sensitivity, I was starting to see as something far darker. And when I finally found the courage to voice my concerns, their response would leave me shattered, caught between loyalty to family and the need to protect myself from someone who clearly meant me harm. In the days that followed those first unsettling incidents, I began to notice the broader picture more clearly. It wasn't just about the coffee. It was about years of subtle hostility that I had brushed aside, excused, or learned to live with. My sister Danielle had always been at the center of our family dynamic, like a gravitational force, pulling everyone's attention toward her. When we were children, my parents adored her charm, her outgoing personality, the way she could walk into a room and win everyone over. They praised her when she performed in school plays, celebrated her athletic awards, and comforted her through every heartbreak. I was the quieter one, the steady one, the daughter who got good grades and never made trouble. And because I didn't demand attention, I didn't receive much of it either. That was the foundation of our relationship. She took up all the space, and I learned to shrink myself down to fit into the corners. As adults, that imbalance didn't disappear. It deepened. Danielle's return to our family home after her breakup only highlighted the old patterns. She strutted around the house as if she still owned every room, her voice loud, her presence commanding. She criticized the way I dressed, mocked my careful budgeting, and often rolled her eyes when I talked about my work as a graphic designer. "So you just sit around doodling all day?" she'd say with a smirk, even though I worked hard to make a living. Our parents, instead of correcting her, would chuckle as though her sharp comments were harmless jokes. But they weren't harmless to me. They chipped away at my sense of self, leaving me to wonder if maybe she was right, if maybe my contributions really did pale in comparison to her larger-than-life personality. The forgive and forget mentality was woven into the fabric of our household. Whenever Danielle crossed a line, my parents would downplay it. "That's just how she is," my mother would say. "She doesn't mean any harm." My father would nod and add, "She's your sister, Claire. You have to be the bigger person." That phrase, "be the bigger person," had become a leash around my neck, tightening every time Danielle lashed out. It meant that no matter what she did, I was expected to absorb it quietly, to patch things up, to never make waves. Forgiveness wasn't a choice in our house. It was a commandment, one that always fell squarely on my shoulders. And for years I complied, even as resentment simmered beneath the surface. Looking back now, I realized that Danielle thrived in that environment. She knew she could get away with almost anything because our parents would cover for her, excuse her behavior, and scold me if I resisted. That enabled her to grow bolder, to test boundaries with the knowledge that she wouldn't face real consequences. Small betrayals became bigger ones. She borrowed my clothes without asking and returned them stained or ruined. She spread personal details of my life to friends and relatives under the guise of joking around. Once she even canceled a date I had by pretending to be me on my phone and then laughed about it afterwards as though it were a harmless prank. Each time I protested, I was met with the same refrain from our parents. "Let it go, Claire. You two need each other. Family is family."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By the time the coffee incident happened, the hidden problem had already been festering for years. Danielle's need for control, for dominance, wasn't new. It was just escalating.
What unsettled me was how easily my parents slipped back into the old patterns, refusing to acknowledge that something serious might be happening. After my first dizzy spell, they didn't ask Danielle a single question. Instead, they looked to me for answers, as though I was the one creating drama. It reminded me of all the times growing up when Danielle had twisted situations to her advantage. She had a way of making me look unstable, overly sensitive, or prone to exaggeration. It was a narrative she built carefully, and one that my parents had accepted long ago. Now, that narrative was working in her favor again, deflecting suspicion away from her and back onto me. The hidden problem wasn't just Danielle's behavior, it was the system that allowed her behavior to thrive. I was trapped in a cycle where speaking up made me the problem, where silence was expected, and where forgiveness was demanded even before an apology was ever offered. And the most insidious part was how normal it all felt within our household. To outsiders, we might have looked like a loving family living in a quiet Ohio town, sharing meals around the dinner table and making small talk about the weather. But beneath that surface was a truth I had learned too well. Harmony was maintained by ignoring the cracks, and those cracks were growing wider every day. One night, as I lay awake in my room, the dizziness still lingering in my body, I thought about all the times I had brushed aside my instincts, like the time in high school when Danielle accidentally deleted my project off our shared computer the night before it was due, or the time she whispered lies about me to friends at church youth group, then claimed she was just kidding. Back then, my parents' solution had always been the same: forgive her. But forgiveness had never stopped Danielle from repeating her behavior. It had only encouraged her to escalate. Now, as an adult, I was beginning to see the pattern clearly. Forgiveness without accountability isn't kindness, it's permission. And I had been giving her permission my whole life, with my parents standing by, reinforcing it. It was around this point that I began journaling quietly at night, writing down every strange symptom I felt, every suspicious interaction with Danielle, and every dismissive comment from my parents that left me feeling smaller than I already was. That habit of writing things down made me hyper-aware of patterns, and I noticed that Danielle seemed particularly interested in my morning routine. She was always the first in the kitchen now, an odd reversal from her usual late rising, and she always seemed eager to hand me a mug of coffee. The more I declined, the more irritated she grew, masking it under a smile but unable to hide the tension in her jaw. On this particular morning, she was already there, standing at the counter with 2 mugs waiting. "Come on, Claire," she coaxed, her tone sugar-coated in a way that didn't fool me anymore. "You've been so stressed. Just let me do something nice for you." Something in her eyes, that flicker of challenge, made me pause. Against my better judgment, against the screaming in my gut, I took the mug and sat down at the table.
At first, nothing seemed different. The coffee was smooth, perfectly sweetened, the way she knew I liked it. We made small talk, well, Danielle talked, filling the silence with stories about how she might go back to school or maybe move to Chicago. I nodded distractedly, sipping as though I were playing a part in a play I'd been cast in against my will. But 20 minutes later, it hit me like a freight train. My vision blurred so fast I nearly dropped my phone. The floor felt unsteady beneath me, my heartbeat erratic and pounding against my ribs. This wasn't a headache or a faint spell. This was my body shutting down. I stumbled toward the living room, clutching the edge of the couch for support, but the strength in my legs gave out. Danielle appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame with her arms crossed, watching me with what I can only describe as cold detachment. "Maybe you should lie down," she suggested, her voice almost mocking. My stomach dropped as realization settled like ice in my veins. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't in my head. She had done something to me, and she knew exactly what she had done. I managed to get to my room and collapsed on the bed, trembling as waves of nausea and dizziness racked my body. Panic clawed at my chest as the thought repeated itself. She poisoned me. The word poison felt dramatic, almost like it belonged in a novel rather than my life. But my body told me otherwise. My instincts screamed louder than my doubts ever had. In a haze, I pulled out my journal and scribbled the date, time, and what I had just drunk. My handwriting was shaky, uneven, but I needed it on paper. I needed proof, even if no one believed me. For nearly 2 hours, I lay there, drifting in and out of a restless sleep, my body weak and drenched in cold sweat. By the time my parents returned home from running errands, I was still pale and disoriented, trying to find the words to explain what had happened. When I finally told them, the reaction was crushing. "Danielle made the coffee," I said quietly, my voice hoarse, and after I drank it, I felt like I was going to collapse. "This isn't normal. I think she's putting something in it." My parents exchanged a look, the kind of silent communication parents perfect over decades of marriage. My mother sighed heavily and set down her grocery bag. "Claire," she said gently, as though soothing a child with a nightmare, "you've been under so much stress, you're probably imagining the worst." My father added, "Danielle wouldn't do something like that. She's your sister. Don't you think you're overreacting a little?" The dismissal stung worse than the sickness. Danielle, sitting on the couch with her phone in hand, didn't even bother to look guilty. Instead, she smiled faintly, as if the entire situation amused her. "Wow," she said, her voice dripping with false hurt. "You think I'd poison you? That's insane, Claire. Honestly, maybe you should see someone about this paranoia." I wanted to scream, to shake them until they understood that I wasn't paranoid, that something real and dangerous was happening. But my body was still weak, my mind clouded, and their disbelief crushed the little energy I had left. I sat there, tears burning my eyes, realizing that I was utterly alone in this. My parents had chosen their narrative long ago. Danielle could do no wrong, and I was the dramatic one. It wasn't just that they didn't believe me, it was that they refused to even consider the possibility. They had already decided which daughter's story fit the world they wanted to live in, and it wasn't mine. That night, lying in bed with the journal open beside me, I faced the reality I had been avoiding. If my own parents wouldn't believe me, then I had to find a way to gather undeniable proof on my own. Because the truth was clear now. Danielle had crossed the line from cruelty into danger. She wasn't just mocking me or sabotaging my belongings. She was messing with my health, my safety, maybe even my life. And if she was willing to go this far, what was stopping her from going further? The breaking point had come, and it left me with no choice but to act differently than I had my entire life. I could no longer rely on forgiveness to protect me. I could no longer wait for my parents to step in. I had to find a way to expose the truth because if I didn't, I wasn't sure I'd survive the next cup of coffee she handed me.
2 days after that breaking point, I sat in my room staring at the half-empty mug of coffee that Danielle had left for me on the desk. I hadn't touched it this time, but the sight of it filled me with both dread and determination. I couldn't go on like this, sick, doubted, and silenced. If my parents weren't going to acknowledge what was happening, I had to find someone who would. That was the day I decided to take matters outside of our home. It began with a simple practical step. I poured the coffee into a small mason jar, sealed it tight, and labeled it with the date and time. My hands shook as I did it, partly from nerves and partly from the lingering weakness that still hadn't entirely left my body. That small jar felt like the only weapon I had against the invisible threat Danielle kept placing in front of me every morning. The following morning, I woke before everyone else and searched online for the nearest toxicology lab. Greenville wasn't a big town, but about 20 minutes away in Dayton, there was a private laboratory that conducted food and substance testing. The thought of going there terrified me. I didn't want to sound paranoid or like a melodramatic sister, but I knew in my bones that something wasn't right. So, with the jar carefully tucked into my tote bag, I drove in silence, my heart pounding with every mile. At the front desk, I explained quietly that I needed a liquid tested because I suspected contamination. The receptionist didn't blink, didn't laugh, just nodded and asked me to fill out some forms.
That simple act of being taken seriously nearly brought me to tears. For the first time, I wasn't being told I was overreacting. A young toxicologist named Dr. Mason Ellery came out to speak with me personally. He was in his mid-30s, calm and matter-of-fact. I could tell he was used to people walking in with strange requests, but he treated me with respect. "You believe someone has tampered with this?" he asked, holding up the jar. I nodded, explaining as best I could without letting my voice crack that my sister had been making my coffee and that I'd fallen ill several times afterward. He didn't press me for unnecessary details, just assured me they'd run the analysis and let me know if anything unusual showed up. Before I left, he gave me a card and said, "If you experience any further symptoms, don't wait. Go straight to a doctor or ER. This kind of thing should never be ignored." His words gave me the validation my parents refused to give me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Back at home, things continued as though nothing had happened. Danielle kept offering to make me coffee, her insistence growing sharper each time I refused. "You're acting weird," she said one morning, narrowing her eyes. "What, do you think I'm trying to kill you or something?" She laughed, but the way her eyes searched my face told me she was testing me, trying to see if I suspected her. I forced a tight smile and said, "I just prefer tea lately." It was a lie, but one I clung to because I couldn't let her know what I was doing. The waiting was excruciating, knowing I might soon have proof, but having to keep pretending that nothing had changed. Every moment around her felt like walking on glass, knowing one wrong word might shatter the facade I was struggling to maintain. Meanwhile, the strain with my parents grew worse. They noticed my avoidance of Danielle, my sudden refusal to drink coffee in the mornings, and they didn't like it. "You need to stop holding grudges," my father said one evening as we sat at the dinner table. "Your sister is trying to be nice, Claire. You're reading too much into things." Danielle, of course, played the part of the hurt sibling perfectly, lowering her eyes and sighing heavily. "I don't know what I did to make her hate me so much," she murmured, her voice quivering just enough to sound genuine. My mother reached over to squeeze her hand, glaring at me as though I had kicked a puppy. The injustice of it all made me want to scream, but I bit my tongue. They didn't need to believe me yet. Soon the evidence would speak for itself. A week later, I received the call that changed everything. Dr. Ellery's voice was steady but urgent as he explained what they had found in the coffee sample. Traces of benzodiazepines, sedatives, were present in a concentration high enough to cause the exact symptoms I had described: dizziness, nausea, disorientation. My hands trembled as I gripped the phone, listening as he laid it out plainly. "This is not something that ends up in coffee by accident. Someone put it there. You need to take this seriously, Claire." My throat closed up. On one hand, the relief of being validated was overwhelming. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. On the other hand, the horror of hearing it confirmed by a professional made my stomach churn. My sister had deliberately drugged me, and now I had proof.
That night, I tried to tell my parents again. I sat them down in the living room, my voice steady as I explained what the toxicologist had found. But instead of shock or outrage, I was met with stony silence and then disbelief. "Claire," my mother said slowly, "do you hear yourself? You took coffee to a lab? Do you know how paranoid that sounds?" My father shook his head, muttering something about overactive imaginations. When I pressed them, showing them the card from Dr. Ellery, my mother's face hardened. "Even if this is true, she's your sister. Families go through rough patches. You need to find it in your heart to forgive her. Don't blow this out of proportion." I stared at them in stunned silence, realizing just how deep their denial ran. Even with scientific proof in front of them, they chose to look away, to shield Danielle from accountability. Forgiveness had become their shield, their excuse to ignore the truth. But outside eyes had seen the truth now. The toxicologist hadn't dismissed me, hadn't coddled me, hadn't asked me to forgive me. He had told me to take it seriously, and that difference changed everything.
I knew from that moment forward that the safe world my parents wanted to pretend we lived in no longer existed for me. The truth had already begun to crack open the facade, and there was no going back. Danielle had crossed a line that could not be smoothed over with a pat on the shoulder and the word forgive. I had undeniable evidence in my hands, and the path ahead would lead to confrontation, whether my parents liked it or not. Once the toxicologist's words had sunk in, a heavy resolve took root inside me. For years, I had been told to be the bigger person, to forgive and forget, to carry the weight of my sister's actions so that the family could maintain its illusion of harmony. But now, I had scientific evidence that Danielle had deliberately drugged me. That kind of truth couldn't be softened, couldn't be excused as a misunderstanding or a joke. Yet, even with that proof, my parents had looked me in the eye and told me to let it go. Their refusal didn't erase the reality. It only forced me to face it alone. And so, quietly, I began gathering evidence, determined that when the time came, there would be no denying what Danielle had done. I started small. The journal I had been keeping became my lifeline. Every morning, I wrote down whether Danielle offered me coffee, how she reacted if I refused, and any symptoms I experienced if I gave in and drank even a sip. I noted her body language, the sharp glances she threw me, the way her tone shifted from fake sweetness to barely veiled irritation, depending on how much I complied. It felt obsessive at times, but I reminded myself that this was necessary. My words alone had never been enough in this family. If I wanted to survive, I had to build a wall of facts around me that no one could ignore. Soon, I added another layer: physical samples. I bought a pack of small plastic containers from a pharmacy and began discreetly pouring portions of the coffee Danielle handed me into them. I labeled each one with the date, time, and any immediate symptoms I felt afterward. I hid them in a shoebox under my bed, my own secret evidence locker. It felt surreal, like I was living in a crime drama rather than my own life. But I couldn't afford to second-guess myself anymore. If Danielle had drugged me once, she could do it again, and I needed to be ready to prove it beyond all doubt. Each container I tucked away felt like a small act of resistance, a way to reclaim control in a house where I had so little.
Of course, Danielle noticed my change in behavior. She had always been sharp-eyed, quick to sense weakness or secrets, and it didn't take long before she began to test me. One morning, when I poured my own cup of coffee and ignored hers, she leaned against the counter and tilted her head. "You don't trust me, do you?" she asked, her tone light, but her gaze piercing. My heart pounded, but I forced a shrug. "I just like making my own now," I replied, keeping my voice steady. She smiled slowly, the kind of smile that wasn't warm at all. "Funny," she said. "You're acting like I've done something wrong." The way she said it wasn't a question, it was a challenge, daring me to say aloud what we both knew. I stayed silent, not because I was afraid of her knowing, but because I couldn't afford to tip my hand yet. If she realized I had evidence, she might change her methods, and I wasn't ready for that. Meanwhile, my parents continued to scold me for being cold toward Danielle. They noticed the tension, but interpreted it in the most convenient way possible, as my fault. "She's reaching out to you," my mother said one evening, exasperated, "and you're shutting her down. This bitterness isn't healthy, Claire. You need to move past it." My father chimed in, "Your sister has been through a lot lately. You should be supporting her instead of holding grudges." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Support her? After she had drugged me? But I held my tongue because I had realized something important. My parents weren't just blind to the truth, they were invested in not seeing it. To acknowledge what Danielle had done would mean acknowledging their failure to protect me, their years of excusing her behavior. And that was something they couldn't face. So instead, they clung harder to their illusion, even as the cracks spread wider. It was during this time that I went back to see Dr. Ellery with 2 of the samples I had collected.
I felt nervous walking into his office again, clutching the containers in a paper bag. But his calm professionalism steadied me. "You did the right thing," he said when I explained how I'd been collecting them. He sent the samples for testing and promised to call me as soon as the results came in. 2 weeks later, his voice came through the phone again with confirmation that nearly floored me. One sample contained traces of zolpidem, a powerful sleep aid, and the other had residual benzodiazepines, similar to the first. Both were drugs that would leave me drowsy, confused, and potentially vulnerable. "Claire," he said firmly, "this is systematic. It's not a one-time thing. Whoever is doing this is targeting you deliberately. I strongly recommend you contact authorities or at the very least seek medical protection." His insistence sent chills down my spine because, while part of me had hoped the first test was some kind of fluke, now there was no denying it. Danielle wasn't just experimenting. She was consistent, calculated, and dangerous. That confirmation only intensified the tension at home. Danielle seemed to sense that her grip on the situation was slipping. She became more aggressive in subtle ways, slamming doors, muttering insults under her breath, cornering me in the hallway with questions like, "What are you writing in that notebook all the time?" or "Why are you acting like you're scared of me?" The mask she wore for our parents began to slip when we were alone, revealing flashes of something colder, something almost triumphant. She wanted me rattled, and though I tried to stay composed, the constant pressure was exhausting. Still, every time I tucked another entry into my journal or sealed another sample in its container, I reminded myself that I was building a shield. One day, the truth would be undeniable, and Danielle wouldn't be able to charm or manipulate her way out of it. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal whenever my parents were around. They continued to insist that I was the one creating tension, their lectures wearing me down until I sometimes wondered if it would be easier to just give in, to drink the coffee and stop fighting. But then I would remember the dizziness, the pounding heart, the way Danielle had looked at me that morning as I collapsed. Calm, almost entertained. That memory burned like a warning sign in my chest. No, I couldn't stop. I had to keep gathering, keep documenting, because if I didn't, I might not get another chance. The stakes were no longer about being believed or vindicated. The stakes were survival. And deep down, I knew the confrontation was coming. Danielle wouldn't sit back quietly forever. She knew I suspected her, and soon enough, she'd push back in ways that would test everything I thought I was capable of enduring.
The day everything shifted started out deceptively ordinary. It was a Saturday morning, and sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, cutting sharp golden lines across the countertop where Danielle stood with her ever-present smirk. She had already prepared a pot of coffee, as usual, and offered me a mug with a falsely sweet tone. "Here, Claire, I made it just how you like it." I felt my stomach knot at the familiar routine, but instead of refusing outright, I decided to accept the cup. My hands trembled slightly as I took it, but I didn't drink. Instead, while Danielle was distracted at the sink, I discreetly poured the contents into a thermos I'd hidden inside my oversized cardigan pocket. By now, my nerves had become practiced in this game of deception, and I knew I needed fresh evidence for what was coming next, because the toxicologist's warnings still echoed in my ears: systematic, deliberate, dangerous. And I knew the day was nearing when I'd have to stop hiding and expose the truth outright.
That afternoon, my parents planned a small family brunch, inviting a few neighbors over. It was one of those events where everything had to look perfect, the kind of occasion my mother lived for. Danielle, ever the golden child, charmed the neighbors with her practiced laugh and exaggerated stories about her successes. I stayed quiet, sitting at the edge of the table, but I couldn't stop studying her face. It struck me, then, how skilled she was at weaving masks, how easily she slipped into the role of the responsible, loving daughter in front of others. Watching her, I understood why my parents always defended her, why they couldn't, or wouldn't, see the darker truth. To them, admitting that their sparkling daughter was capable of harming her own sister was unthinkable. But I was about to give them no choice. That evening, I drove straight from the brunch to Dr. Ellery's office with the thermos. He had agreed to meet me even though it was late, clearly as concerned as I was. I handed over the coffee sample, my hands clammy with dread. "Please," I whispered, "I need to know what's in this one. I need something concrete." He promised to rush the test, and 2 days later, his voice came through the phone with the results that would change everything. "Claire," he said, his tone grave, "this coffee contained not just sedatives. It had a dangerous mixture of zolpidem and crushed antihistamines. Taken together, in the dose present here, it could have caused respiratory distress or even cardiac complications. Claire, this wasn't just an attempt to make you drowsy. This could have been lethal." My body went cold, as though every drop of blood had drained away. For weeks, I had known Danielle was poisoning me, but hearing it confirmed in such stark, unforgiving terms made my knees buckle. Until that moment, a small part of me had clung to the possibility that maybe she was only trying to scare me, to exert control, to humiliate me. But now I couldn't escape the truth. My sister hadn't just been playing a cruel game. She had crossed into life-threatening territory. She wanted me incapacitated, or worse. And suddenly, the memories of my dizzy spells, the choking nausea, the blackouts, each one flashed in my mind as terrifying proof that I had narrowly escaped something much darker. Dr. Ellery urged me to act. "You cannot stay in that environment, Claire. I don't say this lightly. You're in danger. I can provide a formal report and toxicology findings. You need to take these to the police." His words thundered in my head as I sat clutching the phone, staring blankly at my bedroom wall. Police. Authorities. For years, I had avoided that step because I wanted to believe it wouldn't come to this. I had convinced myself that if I just endured, if I just gathered enough evidence, something would change on its own. But this was no longer about endurance. It was about survival. That night, I decided to tell my parents. I thought, naively, that with proof in hand, actual lab reports, signed and verified, they would finally believe me. I waited until after dinner, when Danielle had gone upstairs, before I spread the documents on the dining table. My parents looked bewildered as I pushed the papers toward them. "These are toxicology reports," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "They prove that Danielle has been drugging me. It's not just my imagination. It's real, and it's dangerous." At first, they didn't speak. My mother's eyes darted across the page, her lips trembling, as if she wanted to deny the words staring back at her. My father's jaw tightened, the vein in his temple pulsing. Finally, my mother whispered, This can't be right. Maybe the lab made a mistake. You're overreacting." I cut her off, anger flaring. "There's no mistake. 3 separate samples, all confirmed. This isn't some misunderstanding. Danielle could have killed me." My voice cracked on the last words, but the fury in my chest held me upright. Instead of outrage at Danielle, though, my father turned his gaze on me. "Claire, do you realize what you're accusing your sister of? Do you understand what that would mean for this family if anyone else found out?" His tone was sharp, defensive. Not for me, but for the image they were so desperate to preserve. It was then I realized that even with hard proof, they were still unwilling to face the truth. Their denial wasn't ignorance anymore. It was a choice. The breaking point came when Danielle, perhaps hearing the tension from upstairs, came down to the dining room. She walked in casually, glancing at the papers on the table and then at me. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't look surprised. Instead, she gave a soft laugh. "Wow, Claire, you've really gone all out, haven't you? Testing coffee, keeping samples. Do you hear yourself? This is obsession. You need help." She turned to our parents, her voice dripping with false concern. "See? This is what I've been saying. She's paranoid. She needs therapy, not whatever this circus is."
For a moment, I thought I might scream. The gall of her standing there, twisting everything, using my own survival tactics against me, it was unbearable. I slammed my hand on the table, startling everyone. No more lies, Danielle. I have proof, and one day you won't be able to talk your way out of it. You're not fooling me anymore. My voice shook, but I didn't care. Something inside me had shifted irrevocably. And yet, as I looked at my parents' conflicted faces, as I heard Danielle's calm manipulation, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just fighting my sister anymore. I was fighting the entire dynamic of a family that would rather protect an illusion than acknowledge a truth that shattered it. I walked away from the table that night with my documents clutched tightly to my chest, more isolated than ever, but also more determined. If my family refused to face reality, then I would find someone who would, because now I had no choice. Danielle wasn't just dangerous, she was lethal. And the only question that remained was how far she would go to finish what she'd started. After the major revelation, life at home became unbearable. Every corner of the house felt tense, every interaction laced with danger. Danielle had clearly sensed that her secret was no longer hidden, and her behavior shifted from subtly manipulative to aggressively provocative. She stopped pretending for the neighbors, or for our parents, when she realized I had undeniable proof. It was almost as though she was daring me to do something, testing the boundaries of how far I would go. I started to notice small, calculated changes in her routine, extra attention to the coffee she offered, lingering around the kitchen at odd hours, and casual remarks about how careful I needed to be, because I was so fragile. It wasn't just taunting anymore, it was intimidation. The knowledge that she could harm me, combined with the apathy of my parents, pressed down on me like a physical weight. I had to act before she escalated further. I spent countless hours thinking, planning, weighing the options. The idea of speaking out to authorities or the outside world terrified me. I worried about the stigma, the disbelief, the potential backlash. I knew my parents might never fully support me. They already hadn't. And Danielle was cunning enough to manipulate anyone who might be on my side. But as the days passed and her actions grew bolder, the decision became unavoidable. I couldn't stay silent, not when my life was at stake. The choice to speak out wasn't just about accountability, it was about survival. I realized that if I didn't step forward now, I might not get another chance. The first step was documenting every incident meticulously. I collected each coffee sample Danielle offered, noting the time, date, and my immediate reaction. I wrote down every odd remark, every glance that felt like a challenge, every subtle threat veiled in casual conversation. I even started recording short videos of her behavior in the kitchen when my parents weren't around. At first, it felt extreme, like I was preparing for something almost cinematic. But the fear, the adrenaline, the memory of the dizziness and disorientation, all of it justified the lengths I went to. The evidence was piling up, and for the first time, I felt a small measure of control over a situation that seemed utterly uncontrollable. Even as I prepared, Danielle began noticing cracks in her own facade. She had always relied on charm and manipulation, but the tide was turning. She would question me directly, sometimes casually, sometimes with veiled threats, asking why I had been so distant or why I was acting paranoid. One evening, she cornered me in the hallway, her voice deceptively sweet. "Claire, what are you planning? You've been sneaky lately. Don't pretend you're not doing something." I met her gaze steadily, refusing to show fear. Inside, my heart was pounding, but I realized that showing hesitation might give her an opening. "I'm just being careful," I replied evenly, not revealing the depth of the evidence I already had. Her smile faltered for a split second, a crack in her armor, and I knew that her confidence was beginning to erode. Meanwhile, my parents' continued denial weighed heavily on me. They oscillated between passive dismissal and outright lectures on forgiveness. "She's your sister," my mother reminded me endlessly. "Families go through misunderstandings, Claire. You're making too much of this." My father's approach was slightly different. He questioned my judgment, implying that my fear was irrational, that I might be misinterpreting Danielle's actions. That only reinforced my resolve. I realized that speaking out would not just involve confronting Danielle, it would involve challenging the very system of denial that my parents had upheld for years. This was no longer just a sibling conflict, it was a battle against a family dynamic that enabled abuse and ignored danger.
One night, after a particularly tense dinner where Danielle had poured me a cup of coffee in front of the whole family, I made a decision. I would no longer rely on anyone else to protect me or validate my experience. I would go to Dr. Ellery with all my collected evidence, request a formal report, and take it to the authorities if necessary. This wasn't just about revenge or exposing Danielle's cruelty. It was about ensuring my safety and preventing her from harming me or anyone else again. I packed every sample, every journal entry, and every recording into a secure folder. The meticulousness of it made me feel steadier, as though the act of preparation itself was a form of defense. The day I took the evidence to Dr. Ellery's office, Danielle noticed a change in my demeanor. I moved through the house with quiet determination, my hands steady, my voice calm but assertive. She glanced at me, her smirk faltering as though she sensed the shift. I didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her, but inside, I felt the surge of courage that only comes from the awareness that you've made the choice to no longer be silenced. At the lab, Dr. Ellery examined the collection of samples and documents, nodding gravely. "Claire," he said, "this is thorough. If you bring this to law enforcement, there's no way it can be ignored." That validation, combined with my growing conviction, solidified my decision. I would stop protecting others from Danielle's wrath and speak the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or dangerous it became. By the end of that week, I had made the choice irrevocable. Danielle could no longer control the narrative. My parents' refusal to act no longer mattered. I had objective proof, witnesses in the form of scientific evidence, and the determination to confront the danger directly. For the first time, I felt the weight of fear mixed with the power of agency. I was no longer a passive participant in my own story. The stakes were higher than ever. Danielle had proven she would stop at nothing, but I had crossed the point of no return. The secret was out, in my hands, and the path forward would demand courage, strategy, and unshakable resolve. There would be confrontation, backlash, and tests of loyalty, but I was ready to face all of it because the alternative, silence and vulnerability, was no longer acceptable. By the time I confronted Danielle directly, the tension in the house had become almost unbearable. Every room felt like a battlefield, every glance a potential ambush. Danielle had begun testing me more aggressively, leaving cups of coffee and tea and places she knew I would reach for them, offering small, insidious comments about my paranoia in front of our parents, and shadowing me throughout the house with an almost predatory awareness. The knowledge that she had drugged me before weighed heavily on me, and every instinct screamed that her intentions were far from harmless. But this time, I wasn't going to remain passive. I had evidence, I had a plan, and, most importantly, I had chosen to speak, no matter the consequences. The confrontation began one evening after dinner. Danielle had poured her usual cup of coffee for me, this time deliberately leaving it on the counter as if daring me to take it. I didn't. I walked straight to the sink, poured it down the drain, and then turned to face her. Her smirk faltered slightly, though she tried to mask it with a sarcastic chuckle. "Still suspicious, Claire?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. I didn't flinch. "I have poisoned you before, Danielle. I have proof. Don't pretend this is a joke anymore." For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze sharp and calculating. Then she laughed, short, sharp, and uncomfortably hollow. "Proof," she repeated. "Oh, this is rich. And what exactly do you think you're going to do with proof? Make me out to be a criminal in front of mom and dad? Good luck with that. Her words were designed to intimidate, to make me question my own reality. But the months of careful documentation and lab results had prepared me for this. I held my ground, feeling a mix of fear and power coursing through me. I knew the truth, and for the first time, Danielle didn't control it. My parents, as usual, hovered nearby, unsure what to make of the rising tension. My father, with his typical hesitation, tried to mediate. "Girls, please," he began. But I cut him off. "No, Dad. This isn't something that can be brushed aside. Danielle has put my health at serious risk. This isn't about forgiveness or family harmony anymore. This is about safety." My mother's face went pale, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. Danielle, sensing their discomfort, leaned back slightly, trying to regain composure. But her mask was slipping. The carefully crafted image of the charming, untouchable sister she had presented for years was cracking in the harsh light of truth.
I pulled out the toxicology reports, my hands steady despite my pounding heart. "Look at this," I said, spreading the papers across the counter. "These are from Dr. Ellery. They show exactly what was in the coffee and in what concentrations. You can't deny it. This is dangerous, Danielle, and you've been doing it repeatedly." Danielle's jaw tightened, and she looked briefly at my parents, hoping for intervention, but their eyes were wide with shock, the reality of the evidence hitting them harder than any words could. I could see the panic flash in Danielle's expression, a crack in the calm confidence she had wielded for so long. She recovered quickly, though, raising her voice. "You think these papers prove anything?" she said, her tone hardening. "Anyone could have contaminated them. This is ridiculous. Claire, you're delusional if you think this proves I tried to hurt you." Her attempt to gaslight me was blatant, but I wasn't swayed. I had collected multiple samples over weeks, recordings of her behavior and detailed journal entries. Her lies had a limit. I was ready to meet them with undeniable facts. I stepped closer, my voice rising with a mix of fear and conviction. "This isn't about belief, Danielle. It's about the undeniable truth. You've tried to harm me. These labs, these recordings, they all prove it. I'm not going to let you manipulate me anymore. I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending you're harmless. You crossed the line, and now everyone knows it." Her face contorted with a mix of rage and disbelief, and for the first time, I saw raw fear flash behind her eyes. This wasn't the game she controlled. This was confrontation, real and unavoidable, and she had underestimated me. Danielle lunged for the papers in a sudden, desperate movement, but I was quicker, pulling them out of reach. "Stop!" I shouted. "This is the moment you're accountable. No one can cover for you anymore, not even mom or dad. I'm speaking the truth, and there's no turning back." Her chest heaved as she tried to find words, but only a strangled, "You'll regret this," came out, sharp with threat. I knew she wasn't bluffing. Danielle's recklessness had escalated, and now that she had been exposed, she might attempt retaliation. But I had anticipated that. I had prepared, documented, and now I had the support of undeniable proof outside the family dynamic. By the end of the night, the confrontation left the house in a tense silence. Danielle retreated to her room, glaring but unspoken, while my parents sat frozen, their denial faltering under the weight of undeniable evidence. For the first time, the family dynamic shifted. The mask Danielle had worn for years was gone when it mattered most. She couldn't charm her way out, she couldn't gaslight effectively, and I was no longer willing to absorb the consequences silently. The confrontation had escalated the pressure, brought the danger into the open, and forced everyone in the house to confront the reality they had been avoiding. As I went to bed that night, adrenaline still thrumming through my veins, I realized something crucial. The real battle was only beginning. Danielle had been cornered, and a cornered predator is unpredictable. I knew the next days would test every ounce of courage and strategy I had. But the important thing was that the truth had come out of the shadows. Danielle's mask had fallen, the evidence was irrefutable, and my voice was finally heard. Now there was no turning back. The stakes were higher than ever. The opposition had been exposed, and the path forward would demand everything I had. The days following the confrontation felt like walking through a fog of tension and uncertainty. Danielle had retreated to her room, but her presence loomed over the house like a storm cloud, and the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on me. Even though I had spoken the truth, even though I had gathered undeniable proof, the emotional and physical toll was staggering. My hands trembled constantly, a residual effect from the months of exposure to her poisoned drinks and the stress that had mounted as I documented her every move. Sleep became fragmented. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced that every cup of coffee, every glass of water left within reach could contain something lethal. It was a paranoia born not from imagination, but from living under a sister's calculated cruelty while my parents refused to acknowledge the danger. The isolation weighed on me most of all. Danielle's manipulations had succeeded in making me question my own instincts for so long that even now, after proof and confrontation, I felt a lingering uncertainty. My parents had not fully taken my side, despite seeing the evidence. My mother vacillated between concern and denial, insisting that we still try to keep peace in the family, while my father remained quiet, as though choosing not to confront Danielle was safer than acknowledging the full extent of her actions. This half-hearted support left me feeling abandoned. I had no ally within the walls of the home I had lived in my entire life, and that solitude magnified every fear. Even Danielle's silence was oppressive. The absence of her overt threats didn't feel like relief. It felt like a suspended tension, a waiting game where I knew she would strike again when I least expected it.
Every routine became a minefield. I double-checked every beverage, scrutinized every meal, and avoided certain rooms when Danielle's door was closed. The constant vigilance was exhausting, and the physical symptoms, dizziness, lingering nausea, heart palpitations, surfaced with alarming frequency. I began to notice small tremors in my hands when I tried to eat, and the fatigue weighed so heavily on me that even the smallest task felt monumental. My journal, once a source of empowerment, became a lifeline for coping with the overwhelming anxiety. I recorded every symptom, every encounter, every flicker of suspicion, not only for evidence, but as a way to ground myself amidst the chaos. Yet, even as I wrote, my mind spiraled through what-ifs and maybes, wondering if Danielle had escalated in ways I hadn't yet anticipated. The psychological burden was compounded by fear of reprisal. Danielle's glances when she passed me in the hallway, her casual remarks about how careful I needed to be, and the way she lingered in common areas long after my parents had gone to bed, all reinforced a silent but palpable threat. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was under constant surveillance, that my every move was being cataloged and judged. The paranoia wasn't irrational, it was a natural response to months of targeted attempts to make me disoriented, vulnerable, and dependent on her control. Every noise in the house, footsteps, doors closing, a glass tipping, felt like an escalation, a potential ambush. Even ordinary activities like fetching a snack from the kitchen or doing laundry became acts of calculated caution. One particularly grueling evening, after a minor confrontation where Danielle had barged into the kitchen while I was preparing my own tea, I collapsed onto my bed and couldn't stop the tears. The combination of stress, fear, and lingering physical effects from previous poisoning episodes overwhelmed me. I felt a profound sense of helplessness that I had not experienced since childhood,
A sense that no matter how careful I was, no matter how much evidence I collected, I might never escape the shadow Danielle cast over my life. I thought about running away, leaving the house, but even that idea brought anxiety. Where could I go? Who would believe me? And how could I protect myself without evidence and formal support? It was during one of these nights, curled up in the corner of my bed with my journal clutched to my chest, that I faced the full weight of the choice I had made. Speaking the truth had freed me in one sense, but it had also isolated me and placed me directly in harm's way. I realized that my courage had a price. I was no longer merely documenting or gathering proof. I had become a target in my own home. The walls that were supposed to protect me felt more like a cage. Every thought of confrontation or retaliation, even the potential legal proceedings, was tainted with fear and doubt. The dark night of the soul was not about Danielle's immediate actions anymore. It was about the looming consequences of the truth itself. Despite the despair, a small ember of resolve remained. I understood now that the fear I felt was inseparable from the empowerment that speaking the truth had granted me. Without taking a stand, I would remain a victim forever, trapped in the cycle of abuse and denial. The darkness, though overwhelming, also clarified my priorities: survival, validation, and accountability. I knew that the next step had to be decisive. Hesitation now would only give Danielle the upper hand she had been denied for the first time during our confrontation. That night, even amidst the tears and trembling, I made a silent vow that I would not allow fear or parental denial to silence me. I would endure the backlash, the threats, and the isolation, because the alternative was far worse: surrendering to her control and risking further harm. The following morning, though physically exhausted and emotionally drained, I began preparing. I reviewed every piece of evidence, rehearsed what I would say to authorities, and created a safety plan should Danielle attempt retaliation. The lowest point had forced me to confront the reality of my situation fully, but it also crystallized the path forward. The dark night of the soul was not the end. It was the turning point, where fear met determination, where despair became a catalyst for action. The moment of reckoning, I knew, was drawing near, and I would not falter. The morning I decided to go to the authorities, I felt a mix of fear, adrenaline, and a clarity I had never known before. I had gathered every piece of evidence I could, my journal meticulously detailing every suspicious interaction, coffee samples stored safely in sealed containers, toxicology reports from Dr. Ellery confirming the presence of sedatives and antihistamines, and even video recordings of Danielle's increasingly aggressive behavior. Each item in the folder felt like armor, protecting me from the gaslighting and manipulation that had defined my life for so long. I packed everything carefully into a large envelope, rehearsing the story I would tell, knowing that clarity and composure would be my only shields against disbelief. The drive to the local police station was quiet, the streets empty in the early morning light, but my heart pounded as though I were walking into a storm. I knew that once I stepped into that building, there would be no turning back. The truth would be set in motion, and Danielle's carefully maintained facade would crumble under the weight of facts I was about to present.
At the station, I was directed to a private office where a detective, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, greeted me. Her name was Detective Harper, and the moment I began to speak, I realized how long I had been preparing for this exact moment. I explained the situation in chronological order, starting with the subtle incidents months before and ending with the toxicology reports confirming the drugs in Danielle's coffee. Harper listened intently, taking notes, occasionally asking pointed questions about how I had collected evidence, the frequency of the incidents, and the effect it had on me physically and emotionally. With each answer, my confidence grew. I could see that she was taking my claims seriously, that the proof I had meticulously gathered was undeniable. For the first time in months, I felt that my reality, the one my parents refused to fully acknowledge, was being validated by someone outside the family system. Once I laid out the evidence, Detective Harper leaned back, her eyes assessing me carefully. "Claire, this is serious," she said finally. You've done an incredible job documenting everything, and with this level of proof, we can move forward with an investigation. We'll need to bring in Danielle for questioning, but with these toxicology reports and samples, this is no longer a matter of he said, she said. Her words sent a rush of relief through me, but it was tempered by an awareness that confrontation with Danielle would be immediate and intense. She would no longer have the luxury of charm or gaslighting. The truth was about to be in front of her face, undeniable, and the moment would be tense. Back at the house, I had to prepare for what I knew would be a confrontation. Danielle had been behaving strangely since I left that morning, pacing the hallways, glancing toward my room, and muttering under her breath. I tried to remain calm, refusing to let her fear or intimidation shake me. When Detective Harper and a uniformed officer arrived later that afternoon, Danielle was summoned to the living room. She entered with her usual confident smile, expecting the day to pass like any other. But that smile faltered the instant Harper began outlining the evidence against her. The papers on the table, the sealed coffee samples, the toxicology reports. It was a level of accountability Danielle had not anticipated. Her eyes flicked toward me, searching for some sign of weakness, but I met her gaze steadily, unwavering. This was no longer about family dynamics or parental denial. This was the undeniable truth presented by facts that could not be twisted, spun, or ignored. The questioning began in the living room, with both Detective Harper and the uniformed officer calmly but firmly laying out the timeline, the evidence, and the implications of Danielle's actions. At first, she tried to charm her way through it, laughing nervously and making dismissive remarks. "This is ridiculous. Claire's overreacting. These samples must be contaminated." Harper was patient, explaining each report and sample with precision, clarifying the chain of custody and the scientific verification. Danielle's mask began to crack, and I could see the frustration growing in her eyes. She was accustomed to controlling the narrative, but here, in the presence of objective evidence and law enforcement, her manipulation faltered. Each objection she raised was met with clear, factual rebuttals. The power she had wielded for so long over my family, over our parents' perception, was slipping through her fingers. At one point, Danielle's composure broke entirely. She slammed her hand on the armrest of the couch, voice rising. "This is ridiculous. You're lying. This isn't true. None of it is true." The officers remained calm, instructing her to sit and answer questions, but the anger and desperation were unmistakable. I felt a surge of vindication, tempered by a deep sense of relief that the danger I had endured for so long was finally being confronted openly. Every detail I had documented, every careful collection of evidence, was validated in this moment. The truth was no longer something hidden behind smiles, excuses, or parental denial. It was present, undeniable, and public. By the time Danielle was escorted to a separate room for formal questioning, the tension in the house had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Danielle's confidence had been broken, and though she attempted to maintain a facade of normalcy, her actions were now constrained by the knowledge that her behavior was under scrutiny from authorities. She no longer dared to leave mysterious cups of coffee lying around or make veiled threats, and every glance she cast in my direction was calculated, restrained, and cautious. The weight of accountability had begun to settle on her in a way that it had never had before. For the first time, I could move about the house without that constant, suffocating fear that had defined the past months. The simple acts of making tea, drinking water, and even entering the kitchen were no longer exercises in vigilance against potential harm.
The legal and procedural steps that followed brought a strange sense of relief. Detective Harper worked efficiently with me to ensure that all evidence was submitted properly and that Danielle's repeated actions could not be dismissed or overlooked. Toxicology reports, journal entries, and even the videos I had recorded were compiled into a formal case file. Danielle's initial attempts at charm and denial were no longer effective. The accumulation of hard evidence created a clear record that could be used to secure appropriate consequences. As the weeks progressed, I learned that the authorities had begun taking steps to restrict Danielle's access to substances that could harm me, and she was required to attend formal interviews and counseling sessions under supervision. The realization that the system could enforce accountability provided a sense of safety that had been absent for years. My parents' reaction, though slow and complicated,
gradually shifted as well. Initially, they were defensive and incredulous, reluctant to fully acknowledge what Danielle had done. I could see it in the tight lines of their faces, the careful phrasing of their words, and the moments when their eyes flickered toward me, almost apologetic, but unable to admit the full truth. But as the investigation unfolded and the evidence was confirmed by professionals outside the family, their defenses crumbled. My mother finally admitted privately, in a voice tinged with shame, that she had failed to see the signs, that she had chosen forgiveness over vigilance, and that she regretted allowing Danielle's manipulations to continue unchecked. My father, usually stoic and reserved, expressed quiet gratitude for my courage, acknowledging that I had acted decisively where they had hesitated. Their recognition, though delayed, validated the months of meticulous documentation, careful planning, and courage I had invested in confronting a dangerous situation within my own home. As for Danielle, the consequences began to reshape her behavior and force her into accountability. She was no longer able to mask her actions with charm or coercion. Supervised counseling sessions, strict boundaries, and ongoing monitoring ensured that her capacity to cause harm was limited, and the knowledge that authorities were involved curtailed her manipulative tendencies. The dynamic that had once made me feel powerless was finally inverted. While the tension in the house did not vanish completely, the fear that had once been omnipresent became manageable. I could exist without constantly calculating risks or second-guessing every interaction. That freedom, small but profound, was the first tangible sign of justice and vindication. I also began to notice a change within myself. The months of fear, documentation, confrontation, and isolation had transformed me. I was no longer the passive, anxious sister who had hidden behind silence and compliance. I had learned to assert my boundaries, to recognize manipulation, and to take decisive action, even when no one else would support me. This newfound strength extended beyond Danielle. It affected how I interacted with my parents, friends, and even colleagues outside the home. I understood the value of evidence, preparation, and measured action, and I knew that my experience had given me the tools to protect myself in ways I could never have imagined before. Beyond personal empowerment, the experience created a shift in the family's broader dynamic. Conversations that had been avoided for years about honesty, responsibility, and the consequences of actions finally began to take place. My parents, though still adjusting, engaged in discussions about accountability and protective measures that had previously been taboo. Danielle, under supervision and with structured interventions, began attending counseling sessions that, while mandated, opened the door for her to confront her own behavior. The household no longer operated under the veneer of denial and forced harmony. Instead, there was a cautious but growing acknowledgement that truth and safety were non-negotiable priorities. Perhaps most significantly, I realized that speaking out had created a ripple effect. I had been silenced for years by the fear of disbelief, the desire for family peace, and the manipulation of a person I once loved without question. But by confronting the danger, gathering evidence, and presenting the truth to authorities, I had reclaimed control over my own life. I had broken the cycle of abuse and denial not only for myself, but for the household as a whole. The transformation was profound. Fear and isolation gave way to empowerment, manipulation gave way to accountability, and denial gave way to recognition. The balance of power had shifted decisively, and I could finally begin to experience a sense of normalcy that had been unimaginable just weeks earlier. By the time Danielle's situation was formally addressed by authorities and the household settled into a cautious equilibrium, I understood something critical. Justice was not about vengeance. It was about acknowledgement, accountability, and the restoration of safety. Danielle faced the consequences of her actions, I had been vindicated, and my family was forced to confront the truth they had long ignored.
For the first time in my life, I felt that the power of honesty, courage, and preparation could overcome even the most insidious forms of manipulation. The new equilibrium was not perfect, but it was real, and it was grounded in the unshakable reality that truth, meticulously documented and courageously presented, cannot be ignored forever.
The weeks following the resolution were a period of both reflection and transformation, a time when the long shadows cast by fear and manipulation began to dissipate, and the sunlight of empowerment seeped into every corner of my life. Danielle was now under close supervision, attending counseling sessions, and restricted from unsupervised access to any substances that could harm me. The tension that had once defined every step I took in the house had relaxed into a cautious but real sense of security. I no longer flinched at every unexpected movement, nor did I double-check every cup of tea before taking a sip. The small victories of normalcy, preparing my own meals without anxiety, laughing freely in the living room, walking through the house without fear, were profound and deeply validating. Each of these moments reinforced the reality that the dangerous control Danielle had exercised over me for years had been dismantled by truth, evidence, and courage. In the days that followed, I took deliberate steps to rebuild my life and strengthen my sense of agency. I joined a local support group for individuals who had experienced manipulation or familial abuse, sharing my story for the first time outside the confines of the home. The act of speaking openly to strangers who had faced similar betrayals was liberating. Their empathy, validation, and encouragement reinforced the idea that my experience, while intensely personal, was part of a larger pattern of human struggle and resilience. I realized that my meticulous documentation, my courage in presenting evidence, and my refusal to remain silent could inspire and guide others in similar situations. This awareness gave me a sense of purpose that transcended personal vindication. It became about using my experience to help others reclaim safety and agency in their own lives. The family dynamic gradually shifted as well. My parents, initially reluctant to acknowledge the full scope of Danielle's actions, began to engage in open conversations about accountability, boundaries, and the importance of truth. While it was a slow process, I observed tangible changes. My mother stopped excusing Danielle's behavior, choosing instead to advocate for structured interventions, while my father took active steps to ensure the household environment was safe and supportive. Danielle, constrained by authority and professional oversight, began confronting her own patterns of manipulation in counseling sessions. Though still a work in progress, these changes marked a fundamental transformation in the family's collective understanding. Manipulation, abuse, and neglect could no longer be ignored, and every member had a role in preventing harm. The equilibrium in the house, once dominated by fear and denial, was now grounded in transparency, accountability, and careful boundaries. Personally, the most profound change was internal. I no longer carried the constant tremor of fear, the hypervigilance that had defined daily life, or the self-doubt that arose from being gaslighted by someone I loved. The months of navigating a dangerous home environment had strengthened my instincts, sharpened my judgment, and reinforced my capacity for resilience. I learned to trust my perceptions, to act decisively in the face of danger, and to demand that my voice be heard, even when those around me initially refused to acknowledge it. The courage I cultivated in confronting Danielle and presenting evidence to authorities became a permanent attribute, extending beyond family matters to professional interactions, friendships, and broader personal challenges. I had transformed from a cautious, fearful sister into a self-empowered individual who understood that protection, action, and truth were inseparable pillars of a safe life. The symbolic moment of my transformation came unexpectedly one evening while preparing tea in the kitchen, the same room that had been the site of so many manipulations and threats. Danielle's presence was minimal, her attempts at intimidation neutralized by professional oversight, and my parents were quietly supporting the new boundaries I had set. As I poured water into my favorite teapot, the act, simple and ordinary, felt profound.
I realized that I could now occupy this space without fear, without constant calculation, and without the weight of years of unacknowledged danger pressing down on me. The teapot, an object once associated with control and threat, had become a symbol of personal empowerment, autonomy, and reclaimed domestic space. The act of preparing tea, a mundane routine, was now infused with significance. It represented the normalization of safety, the reclaiming of everyday life, and the enduring power of truth. Beyond the household, I began advocating quietly but deliberately for awareness about manipulation, abuse, and the importance of evidence-based intervention in toxic family dynamics. I shared my experience through writing, presentations, and conversations with friends in community groups, emphasizing that courage and meticulous documentation are vital tools when confronting dangerous behavior. My story became a template for how one can confront manipulation, navigate denial, and reclaim personal safety without relying solely on the immediate intervention of family members. Each time I spoke, I felt the sense of empowerment grow, reinforced by the knowledge that my actions had not only protected me, but could potentially protect others from similar harm.
Looking back, the journey from fear to empowerment, from silence to truth, and from isolation to cautious equilibrium felt transformative in a way I had never imagined. The months of vigilance, documentation, confrontation, and legal action had culminated not only in justice, but also in the profound reconstruction of my sense of self. Danielle's manipulative power had been neutralized, my parents' awareness and engagement strengthened, and I had discovered within myself a resilience and courage that could withstand any denial or intimidation. I had moved from being a passive victim to an active agent of safety and truth, and the transformation was complete. As the sun set over the house, I looked out the window at the familiar suburban street and felt a quiet sense of peace. Life was not perfect. Danielle's rehabilitation would take time, family dynamics required continued attention, and vigilance would always be necessary, but I was no longer defined by fear. I had found empowerment, clarity, and purpose. The journey had tested me in every conceivable way, but the trials had forged strength, courage, and an unshakable belief in the power of truth. The final image that lingered in my mind was simple yet profound. A teapot on the counter, steaming gently, a symbol of life reclaimed, a home transformed, and a person who had emerged from darkness into her own enduring light. The story that had begun with fear and manipulation now concluded with hope, empowerment, and the undeniable reality that courage and truth can overcome even the most insidious threats.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.